Okay, welcome to our first Ask a Physicist of 2022. As always, I have just a few announcements before we get started. As you can see on the screen, we have a date for our 2022 Beyond Annual Lecture. It is April 14th at 7 p.m. It's called Space to Inspire the New Space Age, and it will be with geoscientist, artist, and astronaut Cyan Proctor. The plan is for that to be in person, and it will be streamed live as well for those who cannot attend. Our next Ask a Physicist is February 28th at 6 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And we have guest presenter Jana Levin, and the title is Black Hole Survival Guide. So we will be sending out more information on both of those events, including registration links soon. So look out in your email and on social media. And then lastly, just about tonight's lecture, it is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel if you want to watch it again or share it with friends. And we've received some questions in advance, but if you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will hopefully get to as many of those as possible. So with that, I will go ahead and turn that over to our Beyond Center Director, Paul Davies.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new season of Ask a Physicist. For those of you who are new, we use the term physicist rather broadly. Basically, you can ask us anything about anything. And so we pick topics from right across the sciences and philosophy, but we're basically physicists. And so I'm going to act as moderator tonight, and the title, I think we've got the Planet of the Apes Fallacy or something a little bit like that. We had that idea because of our guest speaker, Charley Lineweaver, and I'll just say a few words about him, introduction. And when he has finished his presentation, Sara Walker, who you will know from previous Ask a Physicist, will do a response, and then we're going to the Q&A at about the half-hour mark. And I'll introduce Sara properly when Charley has finished. But anyway, Charley is a really interesting character, has an interesting career. Plan A was he was going to be a professional soccer player. Plan B, a scientist. So he chose the scientific path. He's currently in Australia, so it's summertime there. He's in the Research School of Astronomy and Astrophysics at the Australian National University. He did his PhD with George Smoot, who was one of the first people to map the cosmic microwave backgrounds, for which he received the Nobel Prize. And the Australian National University, the president, called the vice chancellor there, is Brian Schmidt, who also has a Nobel Prize and discovered the accelerating universe. And the only other thing I should say about Charley is that you should watch his online MOOC, MOOC, entitled Are We Alone? Well, How Did We Get Here? So without further ado, I'm going to ask Charley to tell us about the Planet of the Apes Fallacy. Over to you.
All right, thank you, Paul. Can everybody hear me there?
I can.
Can you hear me? You can, all right. Now, I'm going to try to share the screen, but I have an issue here. As I said earlier, I haven't used Zoom in about 6 months. But if it doesn't work, I'm going to log back in and I'm just going to talk and wing it. All right, so I'm going to try right now to share the screen. And it looks like it's working. So, and how does...
We see it.
You see it, okay. Well, let me just make it full screen. Oops. How's that now?
Excellent.
Okay, so Planet of the Apes. Now, the original Planet of the Apes was a movie with Charlton Heston, that's the guy with blonde hair there, and it was made in 1968. And it was based on a book by Pierre Boulle, a Frenchman who wrote it in 1963. And the idea here is that he is a spaceman, an astronaut, who has crash landed with his crew on an unknown planet. And he doesn't know where he is. And so he gets on this planet, there are 3 species of apes. The chimps in the foreground, the orangutans are judges in the background, and you can see the militaristic gorillas standing at the doors. And he has a leash around his neck. And so he has been captured by these 3 species of apes. Now, I want to point out the title here. It says, somewhere in the universe, there must be something better than man. I want you to keep that in mind, because although this movie pretends to be about humility, about something better than man, it really is a version of vanity that I will show why it is so silly. But it's the conceit of the movie is very enticing. It was like, oh man, this is a wonderful movie about an alternative reality. It helps your imagination. But let's go look a little bit more carefully at what it's saying. So, whoops. Here's Charlton Heston in a wooden cage, and you can see the key in the guardian's hand, the prison guard's hand. It's a big wooden club, and he's got a rifle. These are kind of like Victorian hairy people that walk around on 2 legs. So in other words, bipedality is much better than the way that chimpanzees get around on our planet now. So at the end of the movie, Charlton Heston and a horse and his girlfriend stumble down into the forbidden zone, and then they see the following. They see the Statue of Liberty halfway buried in the sand, and he says, oh my God, I'm back, I'm home. You maniacs, you blew it up. God damn you all to hell. So he's angry at the people who have caused World War III, and then there he goes, he's banging on the sand with his girlfriend holding his horse. And finally, he has realized that he's on the planet Earth because he has seen the half-buried Statue of Liberty. Now, as a biologist, I have to object to this because I think there's a matter of fact, we should have a formal law called the Planet of the Apes Law of Astrobiology. That is, if you crash land on an unknown planet that has horses and corn and mute Homo sapiens and 3 other species of great apes speaking English, you don't need the half-buried Statue of Liberty to know that you're on Earth. That's what I think should be formalized as a law. Now, here's a crude version of this thing. The Planet of the Apes hypothesis, the crude version goes like this. Humans are at the top of some pyramid, then apes, dogs, sheep, vertebrates with half a brain, and at the bottom are bacteria, worms, fungi, and stupid things. So we are in the intelligence niche at the top, and this intelligence niche towards which all, or at least some species, should evolve. Now, that means the apes are waiting in the offings, waiting to fill the intelligence niche. So along comes World War III or a Ukrainian crisis with Russia and the US, World War IV, or 5 or 6, or some asteroid impact, or any kind of thing that's going to wipe off humans. And then what will happen? The other apes will evolve towards the intelligence niche. This is the crude version. Now, another way to call this is the stupid things get smarter model of animal evolution. Another way to say it is my adaptive strategy is better than your adaptive strategy. Now, the fancy version of the Planet of the Apes, I'm being a little bit more generous towards this idea, and that is, there is a human-like intelligence niche. There is selection pressure on other species, including our ancestors, to occupy this niche. And in our absence, in a terrestrial setting or on other planets, some species will evolve into that niche and develop technology. Now, when you do it, I've done surveys about this. Matter of fact, I should say that this is an important question because most biologists, or even astrobiologists, they're interested in finding life elsewhere. But most people are not. Most people don't care if we find bacteria on Mars. They're interested in finding human-like intelligence creatures with whom we can talk and with whom we can exchange ideas about the origin of the universe and the laws of physics. But when I've done these surveys, I've asked people, is human-like intelligence a convergent feature of evolution? Should we expect it elsewhere? Should we expect human-like intelligence elsewhere? And when I've done these surveys, the crude result is that biologists almost 100%, maybe something like 80 to 90% will say, no, we should not expect such intelligence elsewhere. But physicists in Hollywood say, yes, we should. So I would maintain that biologists know more about the evolution of life forms than physicists and Hollywood scriptwriters. So that's why I'm on the biologist side of this argument. Now, here's Frank Drake, and he has got an equation in the background. He's become very famous because he was one of the SETI pioneers. He almost invented the SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And I had the fortune to sit on a plane next to him on a plane from Mexico City to Oaxaca. And I had been teaching a course called Are We Alone? So I said to Frank, I took advantage of this and said, Frank, why do you think there are intelligent aliens who have built radio telescopes? Because that's what SETI is basically, radio telescopes looking for other radio telescopes. And I said, what do you think is the strongest evidence for the idea that human-like intelligence is a convergent feature of evolution? And he looked at me and he's very seriously, and he said, read Harry Jerrison. Now, Harry Jerrison is a paleoneurologist. This is a guy in the last few decades has been going around measuring the brain cases of critters that have gone extinct as a function of time. And he has essentially invented the term encephalization quotient. So here's a plot from the book, Harry Jerrison, 1991. And on the x-axis is time starting 200 million years ago. And then today is on the right at 0. On the y-axis is encephalization quotient. That's essentially, you can think of it as how big your brain is compared to your body. And Homo sapiens are in the upper right. Now, and I would suggest, I looked at this and I said, this sketch is not evidence for a general trend toward increasing EQ. And people have said, well, why not? Well, here's an example. Suppose you are an elephant and you're looking around and you're saying, I am so good. I'm the best species on this planet. What makes me so good? And they said, well, I have got tough skin, but a lot of, rhinos have tough skin. But what I have is the ratio of my nose length to my body length. I'm going to call it nasalization quotient. And I have the largest one. Let's plot that to show how special I am. And when you plot that, this is the plot you get. It's remarkably similar to the plot that we have made with encephalization quotient. It's just as an elephant, when you recognize your extreme quality and plot it, you will see that there appears to be a trend towards you. But that's only because you have put yourself in the upper right of the plot, and that's what's called bias and no good data analysis. So this is not evidence for a general trend towards larger noses any more than the encephalization quotient that we have put ourselves in the upper right is evidence for increasing brain size. So this sketch is not evidence for a trend towards increasing nasalization quotient because we have chosen the y-axis so that the species of interest is by definition in the upper right. Now, one very important piece of information we need to know about ourselves is how long did it take us to get such big brains? We have this very large brain comparatively. There are other creatures with larger brains, but we have a relatively large encephalization quotient, brain size compared to body size. Well, here's a plot of, we look at fossils, and when we do that, we see that it took about 2 to 3 million years for our brains to go this big to this big. So increased by a factor of 3, is the y-axis is the size of the brain, and you can see it is increased by a factor of 3 in about 2 or 3 million years. Now that's an important piece of information because I'm going to compare that time scale to the time scale for half a dozen long duration experiments in vertebrate evolution that have already tested the Planet of the Apes hypothesis. So here you have at the bottom, you have the present day at the bottom here. And then you have 60 million years ago, and you can see that the continents have been drifting around. Because the continents have been drifting around, they have acted as, for landlocked vertebrates, they have functioned as long duration experiments in evolution. What does evolution predict? What does evolution produce on a very, very large, with millions of species on each one of these island continents over very, very long periods of time, 50 million years, 100 million years. So I'm going to make a plot here of the previous 200 million years and show you the individual island continents. So here we have on the y-axis 200 million years ago to today in the upper left. And then we have, I'm in Australia, so here's Australia. And here's New Zealand over here. Here's Madagascar, and here's South America. And so these are just the continents that broke up. Pangaea broke up 180 million years ago, et cetera. So it's just a simple way to represent the independent continents that have acted as independent experiments in vertebrate evolution over the past 200 million years. And then when you look at the results of these experiments, you get things like, well, first of all, look in the upper left here, we have 2 to 3 million years. That's the scale at which our brain increased in size by a factor of 3. You can see it's a tiny fraction of the 200 million years there, right? So it's like 1% or so. So that's how long it took us to get these big brains. And you think, well, if it took us 2 million years, why couldn't it take some other species 2 million or 3 million or 5 million? So what did these independent experiments produce? Well, look at New Zealand. New Zealand is very isolated. And here's Jared Diamond, the guy with the beard here, shaking hands with Bill Clinton, says, New Zealand is as close as we will get to the opportunity to study life on another planet. He said that because it's a big landmass and it's been isolated from other land masses for a very, very long time. And so when you look at this experiment of many, many thousands of species, what did they produce? If you have a species and one of them, an individual, is a little bit smarter, then presumably that will help them survive and they will leave more offspring and they will get smarter and smarter and smarter. But let's see what happened over these 100 million years in New Zealand. Well, this is what happened. They have these are candidates for the smartest things that New Zealand produced in about 100 million years, a tuatara maybe on the left or a kiwi on the right. How about in Australia, where I'm talking to you from now? In Australia, well, are these candidates? Maybe these are candidates for the smartest things that Australia has produced, a kangaroo or a koala. The same thing, we can look at other continents. Let's look at the other continents, these islands, these independent experiments. Here's Madagascar. Maybe the ring-tailed lemur is the smartest thing that Madagascar produced. Or how about India and Asia, India as it was moving north and create the Himalaya mountains. It was independent before it did that. And this may be what it produced. South America was independent for about 100 million years, and this is what it produced. Now, the point of all this is that when we plot them and associate the pictures with the continents, that there doesn't seem to be any evolution towards human-like intelligence on any of these long-term experiments in landlocked vertebrate evolution. So you can't point to any species and say, oh, that thing is trying to become human. In other words, that pyramid example of, well, if we fall off, as a matter of fact, we didn't fall off, we're on Africa here, but we weren't even there. And so there was nothing to suppress these creatures from inhabiting the intelligence niche. And so I would suggest that there is no such thing as the intelligence niche. It's just that every creature has the type of intelligence it has needed to survive. In other words, your brain is not there to be smart. Your brain is to keep you alive. And there are all kinds of different kinds of brains, and many creatures don't have brains. But I would like to say that every creature has the type of intelligence necessary to keep it alive. And there doesn't seem to be any convergence on the type of intelligence that we think is so good, i.e. our type. Now, so each of these
continents. Charlie, you will need to wind this up in a few minutes.
All right, I think I will get close. So each of these continents with their millions of lineages had 30 to 50 times longer to produce these intelligences. And now there's several objections. One is we don't see other occupants on these other continents because we are the first and we have suppressed or killed the others, but that's impossible because humans have only been on those other continents for until 1,000. They haven't been there until 1,000 years ago or 60,000 years ago in the case of Australia. So there could not have been, they could not have suppressed this evolution. And another objection is someone does not have to be the first sulfur-crested cockatoo or the first Indian elephant. Species are not inevitable. So by saying someone has to be the first, you're assuming what you're trying to test. And let's see, one other last objection. These experiments don't tell us that human-like intelligence is rare. It tells us that 1 out of 6 experiments produces human-like intelligence. That's not rare. The problem with that is, but we do not know that only 6 continental experiments have been run. There could be an infinite number of Earth-like planets in the universe, and if only one of them produced human-like intelligence, then we would find ourselves on that planet. So similarly, we know of life on one planet, but that doesn't mean that the probability of having life on that planet is 1 out of 1 or 100%. So I want to just end with this last slide, and that is, here's a phylogenetic tree of all life. And if you look here, we are in the lower right, we're the Episticons, we're in green here. And all of these other lineages diverged from ours about 3.5 billion years ago, and none of them produced the type of intelligence that's supposedly convergent. And it's only here, only at the tip did we produce that. And so it's a species-specific characteristic. And there's the protists in the blue there. And I guess I have to stop. But let me just read the bottom. Millions of lineages evolved for billions of years, did not produce intelligence. That is a lot of evidence for the non-evolution of intelligence.
Well, thank you very much, Charlie. That's wonderful, as always, and very entertaining and thought-provoking. And I'm now going to hand over to Sara Walker to give her point of view. Now, Sara is the Deputy Director of the Beyond Centre, which is hosting this series of Ask a Physicist. She's an Associate Professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration here at ASU. She's also an Associate Director of the ASU Centre for Institute Centre for Biosocial Complex Systems, sort of what we're talking about. I should mention, she's a research scientist at the Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. So a lot of credentials, and I'm going to hand over to you now, Sara, to give your point of view. If you could do that in no more than 15 minutes, that's great, to allow plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. That's fine. Thanks, Charlie. That was really fun. So I guess I've been presented with your arguments over the last few years, and they are pretty convincing. And I was trying to think, like, what would be sort of the most convincing counter argument to this idea that we're kind of a fluke and not really special in the context of thinking about the evolution of intelligence. And I think one of the clearest arguments I can make against that view is that we're not really thinking about life at the proper scale, because you're really making very individualistic arguments. Individual species are rare. And so there's this whole set of emerging views about the idea that we should be thinking about life in units of planets and not individuals, in the sense that maybe the biosphere is the proper unit for thinking about what life is and not an individual species or lineage. And of course, this is kind of an old view. It goes back to James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis proposing the Gaia hypothesis. But if you think about the fact that intelligence did emerge on our planet, and we're talking about one example of life, which is our entire biosphere, which happens to manifest in different species that have different sort of lineages of information propagating in them, but they all trace back to a single common ancestor and a representative of the same kind of life on this planet, then it seems to be the case that you could make this sort of counter argument that, isn't it amazing that intelligence evolved at all? And given that we only had one original life event, it was contingent on that event. So maybe it's a likely outcome in an original life event. So that's sort of the crux of the argument, that, you know, given one example of life, we have intelligence. So why not? Why is it not likely? And so Charlie put up, this nice slide about his conversation with Frank Drake. I've never actually met Frank Drake in person, but have a lot of connections that know him. And he is a historical figure, and his equation does play a really prominent role. But if you look at the structure of the equation, it's written in terms of probabilities of certain events happening. And of course, the ones we don't know are all of these ones on the right-hand side of the equation. So when this equation was originally written down in decades ago, I think it was like 1953 that the Drake equation was first written down, we didn't know the likelihood of forming Earth-like planets and some of the things on the left-hand side, but those are now pretty well constrained based on data from exoplanet science. But the fraction of planets that actually give rise to life and how many of those biospheres actually evolve intelligence are completely unconstrained. So part of the reason that we can even have this debate tonight is because we actually don't know, based on a sample of one planet that ever evolved life and ever evolved intelligence, what the actual likelihood of these events occurring is. So making an argument in sort of one extreme or the other is actually a little bit premature from my perspective. One of the reasons for making that argument is actually when you try to start to think statistically about weighing the probabilities of the original life happening on Earth versus the likelihood of it happening on other planets, there's lots of ways we can maybe constrain the original life on Earth, or this probability of life term that we might put into some kind of statistical framework. But we actually don't know the probability of the original life event. And when we start trying to think about how could we constrain that from data from exoplanets and things like that, we start to realize that sort of we're observers in the universe, and looking back on our own original life event, we actually can't constrain those prior probabilities. And the first person that really like articulated that sort of argument very clearly was Brandon Carter, arguing anthropically about the likelihood of the original life event happening in our universe based on the observational evidence that we're here to observe it. And it turns out if you run these kind of Bayesian frameworks for trying to constrain our own original life event, or any of the events that we are contingent on, like the origin of multicellularity or the origin of intelligence, although multicellularity we know happened multiple times, there's appear to be a series of bottlenecks that we can't, if they're unique events that happen on Earth, like say eukaryogenesis, the origin of life, or the origin of human-like intelligence, we can't constrain the likelihood of those happening just based on the data we have from Earth, because the probability space is not easily constrained by a single data point. And so as I was saying, I think it's a little bit premature to say it's, human-like intelligence is totally rare or it's totally common. But I think this idea of thinking about the emergence of intelligence or intelligent civilizations or physical systems that have some kind of knowledge and behave intelligently, removing the anthropocentric words we use to describe ourselves, that might be part of the sort of evolution of life on planets as a natural outcome of sort of this complexification that Charley was so eloquently arguing against, that there's no tendency to increase intelligence in evolution. There's no tendency to increase in complexity. But if we actually are to explain our situation as we observe it now, and we want to develop some fundamental laws or rules for that, it seems to be the case that that's actually the key feature that we want to explain, because that's the key feature that stands out as a little bit odd about our planet. And so if you look at Earth and you compare Earth to other planets, it's very clear that having a biosphere, or even a technosphere, thinking about us as a technological civilization. So again, not thinking about humans as an individual niche species that filled some sort of, cognitive niche in a particular environment on Earth, but now thinking about us as a planetary scale phenomena that has evolved out of our biosphere, and our technosphere is a product of that. Having a biosphere is a definite state of the Earth, which is in some sense, that the original life, it was favored over states of the Earth devoid of life. And now we have a technosphere, which is somehow favored over states devoid of having a technosphere in the modern situation. So that's something that Eric Smith has argued about in the context of origins of life, but I think the argument stands as far as a technosignature as well. And David Grinsmith has argued that life is something that happens to a planet, not on a planet. So we really need to think about these processes as being co-evolutionarily planetary context. And we can't just think about that isolated species in that particular niche environment that just happened to evolve intelligence, but actually think about the global system and how that has co-evolved over billions of year timescales, and why has it seemed to have a general trend of increasing complexity, and how we explain that phenomena. And so there are all kinds of examples. I know Charley was like trying to give examples against this, that we don't want to say that there's any kind of convergence between intelligence of human-like intelligence or other kinds of intelligences. But I thought this paper that came out in Science years ago was very provocative and kind of interesting. So shown on the left here is a map of Tokyo. And on the right is a slime mold that was given a distribution of food that was basically following the distribution of subway stations in Tokyo. And basically what the slime mold did was solve an optimization problem to get to the food sources. But that optimization problem actually happened to map to the way that the engineers in Tokyo actually designed the subway system in Tokyo. So when you look at these kind of hard optimization problems that have fairly unique solutions, it seems that whether you have a group of humans trying to solve that problem using engineering principles, or you have a slime mold that happens to be quote unquote smart, it can kind of solve those similar problems in similar ways. And so in some ways, I do agree with Charley that I don't think that human intelligence is unique. I think what's unique, so certain features of our intelligence you can certainly see scattered across different kinds of organisms in the biosphere. But I think what is unique is that there's a congruence of those kind of features what we call humans. Now, you could ask questions about whether in other biospheres, you might have intelligence that evolves and is in these sort of packets that are associated to individual species propagating in time and merging into new species over time, as in what we call evolution, that every once in a while, a few of those packets converge in a particular species. And on our planet, that happened to be humans, and humans had above average intelligence in that particular biosphere. But I think the statistical properties associated with the emergence of that intelligence are just features of this sort of general trend that life is about complexification. These are the kind of physical principles underlying life. And statistically, we don't need to think about life as individuals, but we can think about life as these kind of functionalities or capabilities that emerge on a planet, and that sometimes they become aggregated in things we would call individual species. And so just thinking about this kind of more generally and like what is sort of the bigger picture scenario, not to think about individuals, to think about life in this kind of broader sense. There's some transition from abiotic to biological systems into eventually to what we call human scale intelligence or technological systems. But a lot of the ways that we talk about that tend to be very anthropocentric to life on Earth, and the probabilities of the particular events tend to be cast in the context of what we see on Earth. And the real answer is we don't know, and we should be actually looking for the principles that describe these things before we subject ourselves to arguments about their probability. And so I'll finish there. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. We're going to open this up to the audience. We've got some questions already been sent in. And I'm going to abuse my position as moderator just by throwing out, it's a question, I suppose, or an idea, which is, Charley makes this quite compelling case there isn't an intelligence niche, or at least not much evidence for one. But I would like to ask, is there an eye niche or a wing niche? Because eyes and wings have evolved independently many times. So it does look like they're a good idea that biology will discover and rediscover and rediscover. Same with multicellularity, popped up many, many times. And so the issue, it seems to me, is does intelligence, is it sort of eye-like or wing-like to be expected, or is it more rhino's horn-like, which, as far as I know,
Elephant nose.
Only once. So there is a concept of a niche, and the question is only is intelligence.
Well, let me push back on that. Can I push back on that, Paul, a little bit? Because what you're doing is repeating what Simon Conway Morris has said, and several others have done. Now, this is a big debate in biology about whether there is convergence or not, or what do we mean by convergence? And you said eyes have it, or wings. Let's talk about wings, for example. Now, if you look at the wings of a bat or wings of a bird, you can both see that there are quadrupeds that are flapping their front two paws. And in other words, those two have evolved from a common ancestor that had front paws that could flap. In other words, when we identify a function, we pretend that these functions are orthogonal to other functions, but they depend on many, there are all layers of functionality underneath that. For example, having mitochondria inside your cells so you can have more energetics to do that flapping. There's no example. You would think if wings were convergent, you'd see thousands of bacterial species who would evolve wings, but you don't see that. So in other words, what you say is convergent evolution is very isolated to a very tiny quadruped twig on the evolutionary tree. So that's not convergence, that's talking about prerequisites that have evolved that are shared in a common ancestor that get modified, and then we say, oh, look, it's independent evolution of flying. I just think that's the wrong way to think of it, because you have essentially isolated functionality as if they did not depend on previous things that were shared in the common ancestor.
Well, flies have wings and they've got 6 legs, but
I know, but they're also bilaterally symmetric, and that's something that was shared by the. It goes all the way back. I mean, the prerequisites for any functionality you can come up with are very, very deep, and to pretend that they don't exist is just silly.
Okay, we're going to take some questions, and I'm going to start with questions from Barbara. Now, she's asked a lot of questions, and some of which I'm going to sidestep, because the first one is about quantum mechanics, but she does ask this question that we have dodged around today. I think, how do we define intelligence? So we've sort of dabbled with that, but it's friend Drake usually says, well, the only intelligence that matters in SETI is the radio telescope building variety. But that's
right.
both of you. What do we have a definition of intelligence?
Well, Sara talked about this in her talk, and that is there are all types of intelligent behavior that has been selected for in the biosphere, and not only in amoeba and protists, but in bacteria and in quorum sensing and viruses. That type of intelligent behavior has been selected for, just like an eye. It's not designed, it has been selected for. So that's what natural selection is all about. I don't think there's a mystery about that. But what I think is important is that Sara snuck in techno, abiotic, biotic, and then techno, as if that were not species specific. Now, now some people would say, no, I'll be the first to say that birds build nests, therefore it's natural. But therefore, I build a home, it's natural. So this whole idea of technology and radio telescopes being human specific is something that we have done to ourselves because of human exceptionalism. I call this speciesism. And I would say if racism is bad, speciesism is just as bad. And that's what we're doing when we say technosphere, because we're identifying something that we as a species do, eliminating and treating like crap everything else, and then saying, aren't we great? The universe is trying to evolve into us. That's the purpose of a biosphere, to be self-conscious like we are. I think that's crazy, because our self-consciousness is probably going to kill us in a World War III or IV, or very soon, for some reason associated with this big brain. And remember, the brain is there to help you survive, not to help you solve math equations.
Sara, do you have a favorite definition?
Well, I vehemently disagree with that standpoint, only because there's no explanation for the fact that we can solve math equations or understand physical reality the way we do, building theories and things, unless there's some actual reason for that, which has to do with the physics of what we are. So I think in some of the sense that Charley, you presented it, I can absolutely agree, based on kind of superficially looking at us and being like, well, we are not special and we shouldn't assume we're special. But at the same point, we do things that we can't explain in terms of the evolutionary properties of other life that has emerged on this planet. For example, as Paul has eloquently argued for decades, you can't explain our deep knowledge of quantum mechanics based on evolutionary principles, yet we have some really deep correspondence between our minds and physical reality. And I think for me, that's a feature that actually warrants explanation. And so if we want to just write that under the carpet as being a weird statistical fluke, I think that's missing a lot of the potential explanation for what's going on.
I wouldn't say it's a statistical fluke.
I agree with you.
Humans are unique, just like every other species.
Well, that might be true, but I don't know. I'm okay with us being special.
I'm not. I think speciesism is probably going to be our downfall and lead to destruction of our species, extinction of our species. I think that's a lack of humility that's really our Achilles heel.
I'd like to take a question from Howard, because it's an interesting one that I've often wondered about. The role of mass extinctions in driving evolution. The actual question is, do you think the mass extinctions may have disrupted or accelerated the emergence of human-like intelligence? And there's no doubt about it that clearing the dinosaurs out the way gave the mammals a better chance. But again, are we just looking back at our own lineage and making up a just so story?
Yeah, that's the problem. Well, for example, the dinosaurs were around, let's say, the biggest land creatures for about 150 million years. And that's one of the pieces of evidence that I sometimes cite as a good example. If you live for 150 million years, why didn't dinosaurs get bigger and bigger brains and then do the kind of quantum mechanics that you're so proud of? And I would say there's no selection in that direction. And I wouldn't call it a statistical fluke. I would call it humans are unique, just like every other species. And the idea that this thing came around and wiped out the dinosaurs and then opened up lots of niches for mammals. Sure, this is one of many extinction events. And I'm not sure you can make any pattern of it other than things go extinct and other things survive, and then those things go extinct and other things survive. I don't think there's a physics or chemistry answer to the question of what those extinction events produce.
So Sara, this could be cast in a very explicit way, that do mass extinctions drive complexity?
Well, I think there is some evidence that diversification is very rampant after a mass extinction. So if you wanted to say engineer a planet from scratch and accelerate the like fast track to intelligence, so to speak, it might actually be a necessary feature that getting that more efficiently would require mass extinctions to happen along the way. That's wild conjecture, but just going back to my original point, there is data to support that diversification in the biosphere, which in general can lead to discovery of more complex, quote unquote, kinds of life forms, happens very quickly after a mass extinction event because there's a lot of niches to fill. So it could be the case that planets that have mass extinction events actually discover intelligence more quickly or more complex life forms more quickly.
So the
Okay, I'm going to
corollary
take
to
it.
that is the corollary to that is that after Don't Look Now, and the movie Don't
Right.
Look Now, and we humans go extinct, that will quickly evolve into higher intelligence, better intelligence.
Well, it could, but Charlie, yeah, but there's also the feature that death is necessary for selection, right? Like evolution wouldn't work at all without selection. So if you think about that at a planetary scale, it seems to be the case that some kind of like, sort of mass, extinction events might be necessary for that kind of process. It depends on what scale you're thinking about it. I agree. It would not be great, I think, personally, I have a personal investment in this if an asteroid hit Earth tomorrow and wiped us all out. But I don't exclude the possibility that intelligence would evolve again.
Well, you not only did you not exclude the possibility, you suggested that it was a good possibility that a better intelligence, a more clever thing, would replace humans.
Yeah, I think it's a real possibility, and the kind of physics to explain what life is I tend to work on might have that as a more likely outcome over the future evolution of this planet, depending on the time window and how rapidly that can happen.
Well, that's the Planet of the Apes hypothesis. That is, we
Yeah.
got up, and then the apes
And
were waiting in the
I'm
corner to
okay
become
with
us.
I'm okay with it.
Okay, I'm not. I'm completely against it. I think it's speciesism and vanity all the way down.
We have more questions.
Intelligence, yeah. Anyway, sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Okay, Prakar is asking, chimpanzees play games and they like watching television and so on. Apparently in Britain, their favorite TV show is Coronation Street. But anyway, the question is, do you think other species intelligence are convertible to human-like intelligence in the proper circumstances? But can we take chimpanzees and teach them human-like ways and I don't know on the IQ scale what they would come up to, but can we adapt their intelligence to be more human-like?
Let me reverse the question. If you look on YouTube, and there's some Japanese research on what they show you numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then they go blank, and then the chimpanzee can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 much better than a human can. And all humans look at this and say, oh my gosh, there's some narrow part of intelligence that chimps are much better than we are, but let's not call it intelligence because we're not it. It's very much like the chess players used to be the most intelligent people until the computers learned how to do it. And then they said, we're going to move the target. Intelligence is now, I don't know, Go games. And then computers figure out how to do that. And then they say, oh, that's not intelligence. It's whatever we think we are. That's what we define as intelligence. And so if we were really intelligent, we would be able to do what chimpanzees can do. But our olfactory lobes are tiny. We can't even do what a dog can do. They have dogs in the airports using their olfactory lobes to figure out if there's drugs there. We can't even develop an odorometer to do that scientifically yet. I can't imagine that. And we can't talk to dolphins yet. Dolphins are talking to each other for a long time. If we're so smart, we should be able to talk to them. Anyway, there's lots of things that I don't think we should try to make other species be us. Let's try to be them for a while and see how far we can get with this supposedly large brain we have.
Well, we don't need odometers because we have dogs.
Oh, we do. Well, that's like we don't need forests. We have wheat. Well, I'll tell you, wheat has us. You mean?
Yeah, no, but I think this question's interesting, but I also think it's kind of posed a weird way, and it goes back to my sort of questioning the notion of individuals, because I think a lot of the discussion that we have about biology is always focused on a species, which the boundaries between species are kind of well defined reproductively, but like genomically and in terms of other kinds of ways we interact with the world, they're not really well defined. So the question is like, where do you draw the boundaries around what you call as the intelligent thing versus its environment and what it's interacting with? And all of these things are actually not these kind of black and white criteria that we're usually talking about. And as far as thinking about teaching animals or to be human-like, I don't think that's really the right way of posing the question. The question is, how do we increase the intelligence of the overall system? And some ways we do that are quote unquote domesticating animals, or as Charlie would say, the wheat domesticated us because the wheat want to have more wheat in the world. If you believe the sort of evolutionary argument, I don't really believe it, but maybe wheat, have the desire to propagate and, have the entire planet covered in wheat. But I think one of the things that will happen over time is that as we become more integrated with our technology, that the kind of distinctions that we make between what we call species or even what we call individuals now will look quite different. Because I think those are just sort of arbitrary categories that we set on the world, just like we make a distinction between biology and chemistry and physics and literature. These are just categories that we place on the world, they're not real things.
I agree completely with that. The problem is that you keep on referring to intelligence as if its main function were not survival. Survival is the Darwinian imperative.
And I don't believe in Darwinian evolution being the fundamental explanation for life, though. So that's where we.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're talking about intelligence today. We'll talk about life tomorrow.
Well, we've got a few more questions, so we should, let's not get into that one. Isabella has a question for Sarah. You talked a lot about probabilities in astrobiology. What kind of information do you feed into your probability models for extraterrestrial life? Is there any data that is really important but might not be obvious? So basically, where do you get your numbers from?
I think the most important data that's not obvious is actually thinking really hard. And this is going to sound kind of silly, but I think one of the biggest problems we have in astrobiology is that we do have data of things happening here on Earth, and we do have data we can acquire on other planets, and we do have data we can generate in the lab. But what we're not doing is actually connecting theory between any of those three things, or actually digging deep enough to have theories about the problems we're talking about. So astrobiology, in my mind, is a field that has a lot of potential, but the reason that it's been intellectually stifled and not able to address some of its biggest questions is because it doesn't have any guiding theory about the nature of the problems that it's actually dealing with. And so we're not data starved, we are explanatory framework starved.
Okay, as that was directed to Sarah, I'll move on to the next one, which is Nicholas is asking, what characteristics are common in the smarter species? And I suppose we all know who they are. Meaning species that generally have an understanding of abstract ideas or plan for the future, generically. So humans are not the only ones who plan, but of course we don't know about abstract ideas, do we? So any thoughts about that? What characteristics are common in these smarter species that plan for the future? Let's just take that.
I would say that what he's doing is planning for the future. What you're doing is, what questions like this are doing is taking what we think, how we think we're special, and then asking what other species are like that. I guess I'm a relativist when it comes this word intelligence, and that is that as I said earlier, every species, every life form has the type of intelligence that has helped it survive. For example, I see roots of it. There's a bush out there. It has roots. These roots talk to each other and talk to other plants in ways that we don't know about, and we're just discovering. And yet we don't call that intelligence. It's chemical communication going on, information processing, understanding, hey, look at that thing over there, that's bad, this is good. That's the type of thing that happens all over the place, whether you have a central nervous system or not. And so I'm not willing to pull out and say, oh, we know it's obvious which are the smartest things. Let's look at what those qualities are. Actually, the qualities are, they're more like us. And that's essentially vanity, not science.
Planning for the future. So Sarah, squirrels do that, don't they? They can be nuts.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna agree with Charlie on this one, that I think we have a tendency to place like our representations of things on other species too much. And I think it's pretty easy to prove that other species might be predictive in the sense that you could build a model of the behavior of a species, and you could like let's say that you know, I have an ant that is, you know, like foraging for food or something. I could predict its future behavior based on some pattern of behavior in the past. And then the question becomes, is that actually an internal model to the ant or not? And people do this kind of research. And I think it's certainly clear that maybe, you know, there are features generic of biology about predicting future states, because that feeds sort of the Darwinian narrative that we're here to select ourselves and we want to persist into the future. But I think we have to be really careful about projecting our ideas of abstractions, what representations look like in our head, and the ability to build models in our own minds onto other organisms. And I think some of that kind of talk is really premature and can be very misleading depending on how we cast it if we're not rigorous enough in how we discuss it.
All right, well, let's take a question from Jasmine. What are the criteria used to determine this scale of intelligence? So we're back to the problem with defining intelligence, and then there is a scale in the sense that for humans, we have IQ tests and people score differently. So we know that that's an idea that is popular among some scientists, and if we apply it across species, so this encephalization quotient, which is just a physical thing. Do people literally do IQ tests across species? I don't know.
Yeah, they do. Yes, they do, but they're ridiculous.
Right.
For example, I take a walk with my dog, and my dog can smell so many things, and I am completely oblivious to all the wonderful world of sight, of smell that they live in. He can process. Oh, I know that this particular dog was here. It peed here. Oh, there's a cat over here. Oh, a possum over here. All of that information about the external world, we are completely oblivious to, much like other species are oblivious to the things that we are aware of. So to try to conduct a cross-species intelligence test is kind of silly. I just think it's an exercise in how many species are like us. That's essentially what we're doing.
Sarah, do you think differently?
I agree on some level, except that I do think, because I think a lot about formalizing what life is in some kind of mathematical framework, and that kind of, in some sense, encompasses the systems that we associate to being intelligent, that there is some way of talking about sort of scale of how alive a system is, or how much it's behaving like in a lifelike way or intelligent way. And I think for me, most of those kind of metrics tend to be associated with how sort of the possibility space of what that particular physical system can do or can mediate to happen in the world. So I kind of associate intelligence with creativity, actually. And other organisms have some sense of creativity, and humans have some sense of creativity. But for me, it's not about selection. It's not about prediction. It's about what can that system do that no other physical system could actually do in the universe, can actually happen because that thing exists.
We've got just a couple more questions.
Well, could I interrupt? I want to say a word first. I want to defend stupidity, for example. Stupidity can be adaptive.
Things.
I know stupidity is very important. For example, our brains could be twice as big as they are, and there are probably good reasons that they're not. And that is they're supposed to help us survive. If your brain was this big, you would be dead. You all your energy, you wouldn't be able to survive. So it's very important to be as stupid as we are.
Right.
But that's
okay.
My bit.
So the other Paul is asking, humans think they're smart, but can they keep themselves from going extinct in the next 1,000 years? And he thinks not, and quotes Stephen Hawking, a similar opinion. Human intelligence will not guarantee our own extinction, not guarantee we won't go extinct. So I think you have touched on this already, Charley.
Well, as Sarah has pointed out, we can be optimists. If we go extinct, something smarter will come along, but I would refuse to call it smarter. I would just call it something that is able to survive through the types of insults that we are not able to.
But,
for example,
what odds would you give humans still being here in 1,000 years' time?
Oh, I agree with Stephen Hawking. I think it's a very strong case to be made that humans will go extinct very soon. And sometimes I agree with Elon Musk, we should make ourselves a planetary species to prevent this from our extinction, but I'm not quite sure that's a great way to go. Maybe we should try to imitate bacteria and get rid of our multicellularity and become unicellular bacterial colonies again to help us survive the next plague and impact.
Yes, bacteria do very well. Sarah, what odds would you give humans being around in 1,000 years?
I will give it 100%. That will still be around in 1,000 years. And I will do that for very good reason, because unless we have optimistic visions of the future and we build them, they're not going to happen. So that chance of us being there in 1,000 years is actually contingent on us believing it can happen.
Well, I'm pleased we're ending on a high note. We're not quite ending totally, but we're going to have to end this for the simple reason that Cedric is asking, is mathematics an inherent feature of the universe or an invention of human intelligence? And would any technological species require the same maths? Well, that's your very topic, Sarah, which you flagged earlier. And I think we should do an entire Ask a Physicist on, what is mathematics? Why can we do it? Why does it mirror nature so well? And I think there's far too much to expect answers to that in the next 1 minute, which is all we've got. So thank you, Cedric, for setting that up. Stay tuned for future Ask a Physicist, and you'll certainly get Sarah's take on that and maybe even mine. It would be remiss of me not to mention the next Ask a Physicist, Jana Levin and Maulik Parikh, who's normally one of our panelists, will be talking about black holes, a survival guide. Not quite sure what's involved in that, but of course there are many fascinating features of black holes. So do join us in 1 month from now. That makes it the 28th of February. It just remains for me to thank very much Charley Lineweaver, all the way from Canberra in Australia. He can go back to his summer sunshine now. And
another 6 months without Zoom.
and our own Sara Walker here in Arizona. So thanks very much to both of you, and of course for all our viewers and listeners, and for your wonderful questions. See you next time.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Charlie.
Sarah.
That's great. Bye. Bye, everyone.